Okay, I'm going to talk to you about my piece To Partake of Eternity. I'm basically just going to go through every decision I made in writing the piece and just to share my creative process. Will it be interesting? Let's find out. To think that my process would be interesting to anyone else probably shows a kind of blind hubris, but I think that comes with being a composer. I speak for myself, of course, but it's the kind of thing that I'd be interested in, so if you find this interesting, that's great, and if not, well, nobody's making you watch this. The title, To Partake of Eternity, is taken from the novel To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, one of my favourite writers. I won't go into too much detail about the novel or Woolf because I'm definitely not an expert on anything. But just briefly, Virginia Woolf along with James Joyce are two of the main figures in modernist literature, known for the use of stream of consciousness in their novels. Some of Woolf's other best known works include Mrs. Dalloway, Orlando, a biography, and the essay A Room of One's Own. My piece is inspired by two passages from To the Lighthouse. The first is at a dinner party hosted by Mrs. Ramsay, the protagonist of the first part of the novel. Nothing need be said, nothing could be said. There it was, all round them. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a specially tender piece of eternity. As she had already felt about something different once before that afternoon, there is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change, and shines out. She glanced out the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby. So that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today already, of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that remains forever after. This would remain. The fight against the fleeting nature of human lives is one of the main themes of the novel, and one of the ways that Woolf offers us is through art. And at the risk of sounding pretentious or self-important, that really resonates with me as a composer. The other passage influenced the music in a more tangible way, and is from early in the novel, where Mrs. Ramsay suddenly notices the sound of the waves, which basically symbolises mortality, and there's a shift in perspective. But here, as she turns the page, suddenly her search for the picture of a rake or a mowing machine was interrupted. The gruff murmur, which had kept on assuring her that the men were happily talking, had ceased, so that the monotonous fall of the waves on the beach, which for the most part beat a measured and soothing tattoo to her thoughts and seemed consolingly to repeat over and over again as she sat with the children the words of some old cradle song, murmured by nature. I am guarding you, I am your support, but at other times suddenly and unexpectedly, especially when her mind raised itself from the task actually at hand, had no such kindly meaning, but like a ghostly roll of drums remorselessly beat the measure of life, made one think of the destruction of the island and its engulfment in the sea, and warned her whose day had slipped past in one quick doing after another, that it was all ephemeral as a rainbow. This sound, which had been obscured and concealed under the other sound, suddenly thundered hollow in her ears and made her look up with an impulse of terror. So the sound of the waves and the shift in perspective are the two main ideas of the piece, but that wasn't how I started writing it. A lot of the time I start with a musical idea and then somewhere along the writing process I discover what the piece is about. One of the things that I decided I want to do in this piece is to write music that is more continuous instead of having one gesture and then another, in the way that some parts of Leaden Circles, my piece for piano and orchestra, is. So there are two main ways that I try to do this. The first is this bass line in the double bass that has a constant stepwise descent, which I think, if I remember correctly, was the first thing that I wrote in this piece. The second is the A harmonic in the violins that comes in and out. I originally had this as a constant held note, but then I was kind of suggested that it might sound a bit like tinnitus, which is why I've taken some of it out, which I think does make it more interesting anyway. So having written the bass line, I then wrote these chords in the viola and cello, and the harmony is basically pendiatonic. That is to say that I use notes within the key or mode without regard to traditional harmonic function. But I do generally favour intervals of seconds, fourths or fifths within the chords, which I think give them a more open sound. A quite well-known example of pendiatonicism is the ending of Stravinsky's Symphonies of Wind Instruments, which is basically in C major, but the way he used it is far from traditional. But what I do in my piece is that I change the key every few bars, so there's a kind of ambiguity. So for instance, the first four chords use the notes from E flat major, D flat major, A flat major, and C major. But within the bars, it's entirely diatonic. I generally favour a movement in thirds, which I think has a kind of shifting quality. The way that I orchestrated this piece was quite elemental, so what I mean by that is that the instruments are mostly used within their groups with quite well defined roles, and I also usually orchestrate from the ground up. So I start with a simple idea, in this case the bass line, and then I add things to it and embellish it. So let me just break down the first 5 pages of the piece, which is the first A section and the first B section, and that basically covers all the material in the piece. I've already spoken about the chords and the strings, and most of the material in the piece are quite similar, with a kind of wave-like profile, but I also like to think of it as like an in-breath and an out-breath. The string chords are reinforced by breath sounds in the trombones, tuba and bassoons, who are playing with their reeds taken out. There's also breath sounds in the horns and a suspended cymbal roll that are slightly offset from the string chords. All of these sounds add a noise content to the chords and evoke the sound of waves a bit more. On the downbeat, the chord change is reinforced by this low gliss in the harp, which just gives a wash of sound. In bar 10, the downbeat is similarly reinforced by the trombones, tuba and timpani. Almost all the violins have to do are these fluttering harmonics, with them being divided into 4 soli who play more intricate gestures, and the rest who play tremolo chords. The woodwind do a similar thing with trills, tremolos and tombal trills, which are trills on the same note or a trill in tone colour. And there are also these short scalic figures. The pitches are all diatonic within the bar, so here it's D major. Occasionally a solo breaks off from the woodwind. For example, the first flute in bar 4 and first clarinet in bar 10. The trumpets have less to do, but in bar 4 they have this trill on a breath sound, which creates a sort of fluttering effect. So now let's just hear the first page. At bar 13 we have the first point of arrival, which is very much driven by the 4 horns, and is underpinned by this low piano octave. There's also this effect in the trumpets where it basically crossfades from a normal sound to a muted sound with the harmon mute, which to me has a kind of smoky quality. Page 4 builds towards the second section, with a build-up in the woodwind that looks quite pretty on the page, and also again driven by the horns. And then on page 5 almost everything cuts out with a loud note on the bass drum, and you're left with some breath sound, a quiet tam-tam note, and this eerie effect of a cymbal placed on a timpani. This section is kind of like a shadow of the first section, with the solo violin echoing the A harmonic and this gesture in the strings. Most of the violins have this high ethereal chord that crescendos from nothing to PPPP in 2 bars. And then there are these incredibly delicate high A's in the piano, xylophone and later harp that are almost like twinkles or drops of water. Okay, so let's hear the first 5 pages. lot of my orchestral effects came from the music of Salvatore Sciarrino, which features a lot of breath sounds and harmonics. The first piece that I heard of his was Introduzione all'oscuro, which you can find on YouTube, and I've just been hooked ever since. The way that I kind of justify borrowing these effects, to myself at least, is that I used them in quite a different way rhetorically. His influence is maybe a little more blatant than Leaden Circles, which maybe verges on pastiche, but I think pastiche is a great way to learn how to compose. You find something that you like, you learn how to write like it, and then eventually you figure out how to do it in your own way. Some of the composers who influenced my orchestration more generally are Henri Duccio and Toru Takemitsu. Their music are some of the most beautifully crafted, and their orchestration are just exquisite. I also have to mention Maurice Ravel, who's one of the best orchestrators there is. Ravel's is one of the pieces that always gets me unreasonably excited, not just because of the orchestration, but that's definitely a big part of it. Structurally and in some ways aesthetically, my piece was very much inspired by Towards the Pure Land by Jonathan Harvey, which is basically symmetrical in structure, and at the heart of it is a passage of incredible stillness, which I find quite breathtaking. You can find the perusal score online, I've put a link in the description, and there's also an amazing performance by the Ensemble Intercontemporain in the Orchestra du Conservatoire de Paris, conducted by Matthias Pincher. I'll put that in the description as well. It's less than 20 minutes long, so I'd really recommend that you listen to it. I also just want to point out an effect at the end of Towards the Pure Land, where he gets the players to quietly whisper consonants with tongue clicks. I think it just sounds amazing. I've stolen this effect a few times, in At the Gates, my concerto for cello and brass band, and a more recent piece for choir, which is the setting of the Song of Solomon. So I originally wanted to do a three-part structure, not necessarily symmetrical, but with a quiet middle like Towards the Pure Land. But as I was writing the piece, that just sort of didn't happen. So what ended up happening was that there are two main sections. The first is this wave-like music that gradually builds up, and then with a sudden shift we get this static second section. And then this happens again on a larger scale. So this is basically the structure of the piece. Within the sections you get these ebbs and flows as well as the lower string chords, so in a way it's fractal-like, with a similar thing happening on different scales. So one of the reasons why I didn't stick with my original plan was that I got to the second section and just ran out of time and had to finish the piece, but also I couldn't bring myself to build it up to the big finale that I had intended with the material that I ended up writing. And this is a thing that I find very often, and I think it's quite common with composers, where you can have the most thought out plan, but when you actually start writing the piece, the music seems to want to do something else, which might be something that you wouldn't have come up with in the first place. Composition hard.